Morning, guys. Today we will be examining the history of the Ottoman Empire in the years leading up to 1789. Formerly Europe's strongest power, the Ottoman Empire had entered a deep state of decline, which would accelerate in the years following the French Revolution. The Ottoman Empire was founded in 1299 by Osman Gazi, a powerful Turkish warlord who ruled a small princedom in today's Turkey, a region historically known as Anatolia. The Turkish people had moved into Anatolia about 300 years earlier from Central Asia and established themselves in a great victory over the Roman or Byzantine emperor at the Battle of Manzikert. The following centuries saw an expansion of the Turkish population of Anatolia, largely at the expense of the region's Greek population, which began to decline. In 1453, the Ottoman Empire, by now a large state straddling both sides of the Aegean Sea, achieved a final victory over the Romans by taking the Byzantine capital Constantinople and killing the emperor. This event shocked and offended the rest of Europe, who already hated the Turkish people for their Islamic faith. Now, as word of the fall of Constantinople spread, the word Turk became synonymous with not only Muslim, but also came to represent an alien other who was coming to invade Christian Europe. This othering of the Turks had extremely prominent racial and moral aspects to it, themes that would become more rather than less pronounced as the centuries wore on. For the time being, a series of crusades by the kingdoms of Eastern Europe did little to threaten Ottoman control or to regain Constantinople. In fact, Constantinople would never be regained and remains in modern-day Turkey today. The Ottoman army in the 15th and 16th centuries was extraordinarily well drilled and organized, particularly when compared to the weak forces that it fought against in Southeast Europe. In particular, the empire made extensive use of slave troops, the Janissaries, whose discipline provided the core of the Ottoman front line. Janissaries were formed of both prisoners of war and boys kidnapped from Christian families in the Balkans and forcibly converted to Islam before being drilled in the art of war. The Janissaries were, in the early days of the empire, small in number and formed just an elite tip of the spear of the larger Ottoman army, which also featured strong units of cavalry as well as the most effective cannons and artillery in the entire world at the time. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, known in the Ottoman lands as Suleiman the Lawgiver, the Ottoman Empire stretched from Belgrade to Algeria. Suleiman, like his contemporary Ivan the Terrible, saw himself as the heir to the Romans and surrounded his court with lawyers and artists from all over the world, whilst at the same time continuing to uphold the tenets of Islam. Suleiman's greatest achievement was the creation of a single legal system to apply to all parts of the Ottoman Empire, one which accounted for the many nuances in his culturally and socially diverse state. Suleiman's empire grew immensely rich through its control of the trade in spices and silks from Asia. Meanwhile, an alliance was formed with the King of France, with relations between the two states remaining close over the following centuries. Many cities in the Ottoman Empire flourished, being developed with Turkish-style baths and aqueducts. The most resplendent city of the empire was undoubtedly the capital, Constantinople, which was known by ordinary Turkish people by the name Istanbul. Istanbul grew massively in size and wealth during the years of Suleiman, and was graced with new architecture such as mosques or baths. Religious tolerance encouraged migration of persecuted people from other parts of Europe. For example, the Sephardi Jews, expelled from the Iberian Peninsula following the Spanish Reconquista and the Inquisition, found a home in Ottoman North Africa, Anatolia, and Greece. On the other hand, some historic cities, such as Athens, shrank into irrelevance, becoming little more than villages overshadowed by the ruins of great empires. Ottoman society was multicultural, with Christian Greeks, Muslim Arabs, and Jewish Syrians living as neighbors. Conversion to Islam was needed to rise in the ranks of the administration, however, and the role of the Sultan as caliph and protector of the Islamic holy cities of Mecca and Medina ensured that the Ottoman Empire retained a strong Muslim character, with the influence of the Muslim clergy over the Sultanate growing over time. The Ottoman Empire expanded little after Suleiman and was thwarted in its attempts to take Vienna or Iran. Successful offensives were launched into Europe on occasion, but these mostly consisted of raids to capture slaves and were often orchestrated by Ottoman puppet states such as the Crimean Khanate. Long, brutal conflicts against the Habsburgs in the west and the Persians in the east sapped the Ottoman army of some of its strength, and as a result the Janissary units were greatly expanded and lost their elite status. A series of weak or indifferent sultans led to power in the empire passing to the wives and mothers of these men, who ran the empire in tandem with the most important non-royal figure, the Grand Vizier. It was from the long period of rules by weak sultans that talk spread throughout Europe of supposed Ottoman stagnation or indecision, with the empire appearing to lack the dynamism of the Western Europeans and their New World colonies. However, we have to be careful here. Whilst the empire certainly wasn't conquering vast swathes of land as it had under Suleiman, it remained extremely rich and powerful and was able to flexibly respond to a number of crises or possible crises. We shouldn't speak of stagnation as it overlooks the complex processes occurring under the hood of the empire, as legal and administrative reforms and disputes continued at pace. One area of dynamism in the empire was the slave trade, with peripheral areas such as the Barbary States or the Arabian Peninsula becoming hotspots for European and African slavery respectively. Slavers from North Africa raided as far north as Iceland, taking back whole villages of slaves with them. Meanwhile, slavers in Africa operated extensive raids that left from coastal regions such as the island of Zanzibar and penetrated into Central Africa. Despite the infamy that these slave raids brought, the Ottomans and enlightened discourse at the time, with, for example, Voltaire's book Candide mentioning it, the Ottomans never developed a system of plantation slavery like that seen in British, Portuguese, and French colonies in North and South America. Slaves were exploited for a variety of different purposes, many of which represented more traditional Mediterranean forms of slavery as from the time of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. These purposes included slaves being used as soldiers or to row galleys or to be used for domestic work. The multiculturalism of the Ottoman Empire also meant that slavery in the Ottoman lands lacked the black and white racialized dynamic that was to emerge in North America. United by a series of effective Grand Viziers who instituted a return to traditional Islamic and Turkish law, the Ottoman Empire resumed the offensive in the late 17th century, conquering Crete and southern Poland and cracking down on rebellious vassal lords in Transylvania. This period of success came to an end with the catastrophic defeat dealt on the Ottomans during the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683. A decade of war followed in which the Ottomans were driven out of Hungary, but did manage to stabilize their front line on the Danube River, with possession of the key fortress city of Belgrade swapping between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans on a regular basis. In the 18th century, the Russian and Habsburg empires continually sought to pick at the remaining Ottoman holdings in Europe and take more lands for themselves, but their efforts were now held back not only by the strength of the Ottoman Empire, but also the power of Christian rivals such as Prussia and France. The Ottoman economy declined from its richest point in the 16th century. The empire's exclusive control over trade routes with India and China had been undercut by the growth of Western European sea power and the Portuguese, Dutch, and British conquests in South and Southeast Asia. In return for their support against Russia and Austria, the Ottoman Empire was forced to give British and Dutch and Italian merchants preferential trading rights in Palestine, a development that precipitated the widespread interference of the British in Ottoman affairs. The central government in Istanbul was increasingly unable to afford the military able to enforce its will in the provinces, and as a result, tax income became hard to collect, and many parts of the empire developed into a semi-feudal system, with local leaders running their corners of the land as personal fiefdoms. Protests in rural areas of the Ottoman Empire and an inefficient system of distribution led to famines becoming more common. When the large Ottoman cities were unable to import enough food to feed the people, their residents rioted. Government crackdowns, often featuring cruel acts of brutality, only further alienated the people and encouraged even further rioting. Reformers, who met in coffee houses and religious seminaries throughout the empire, began to call for widespread changes in Ottoman society. Some of them even looked to the example of the old enemy of Russia and its reforming leader Peter the Great. The religious leadership, however, deeply opposed reform attempts and attempted to censor the release of printed and non-religious works. In this effort, they were joined by calligraphers, as many of the texts produced in the Ottoman Empire continued to be written by hand. Calls for societal reform were echoed by calls for military reform, thanks to a series of defeats the empire suffered against the Russians in the latter half of the 18th century. It was clear that the once cutting-edge Ottoman army and Ottoman navy were now lagging behind the European standard. In particular, the loss of the Crimean Peninsula to Catherine's Russia hurt the empire, as many of the Sultan's best troops had been battle-hardened Crimean cavalry. The Russians, and then later the Habsburgs, also browbeat the Ottoman Empire into acknowledging that they had certain rights to protect the empire's Christian subjects from their Muslim rulers. This opened the door for the interference of both countries into Ottoman domestic affairs. We should be careful, however, not to overestimate Ottoman weakness in 1789. The empire was still able to flexibly respond to certain crises and was more than holding its own in a war with the Habsburgs as the year came to its beginning. Ottoman lands were still very rich and vast, and Istanbul was still a dynamic city and centre of learning. The Ottomans had a useful ally in Prussia and the neutral support of the British and the Dutch, even if said support was based on the latter's hope of economic gains. The new Sultan in 1789, Selim III, would attempt to re-establish central rule over the empire and would usher in a brief age of reforms, which would eventually result in the rapid change experienced in the Ottoman lands in the 19th century, which we shall cover in future lectures.